Welcome to our flipped classroom. This one will regard a women's right movement. We'll start looking at women in the pre-Civil War time period. If your book talked about there were different thoughts on women's role in society early on, the early 1800s, late 1700s, including the women's sphere of influence, terms like Republican motherhood, and a new term that are coming about this time is a term called cult of domesticity. All similar meaning, really mentioning the woman's role. It was largely in the home, and in society is a moral leader. And as you'll see here in the 1830s, 1840s, women's role expanded greatly in this sphere. Now, this was found in a lot of different ways, including a monthly periodical by the name of Godey's Lady Book. Monthly periodical talked about women's role in society, what women can do, especially focusing on the home. And then a book came out in 1841, A Treatise on Domestic Economy by Catherine Beecher, where she talked to women about how to make their home more efficient. Again, this was kind of celebrating the woman in the home. This is not a radical change. If anything, you'll find she's quite conservative. Now, this role, in women's role early on, one of the big movements they moved into was temperance. Your book had mentioned the Independent Order of Good Templars working with the temperance movement. The temperance movement was probably the most successful of all the early women's reform groups. They really took their role as the moral police, if you will. Remember, their job was to raise the children. They took it to a new level, and they exported it out of the home and into society. And it was highly effective, controversial, but very, very effective. Now, with this reform and getting into the social aspect comes the Female Reform Society. The Female Moral Reform Society. It originated in 1834 by Lydia Finney. Yes, she is the wife of Charles Grandison Finney of the Second Great Awakening fame. It grew and by 1840 became a national society. Their focus really was on stopping prostitution. Their focus was mostly on unmarried women, mill girls, and other groups like that. By 1840, they had over 555 chapters, over 40,000 members, and they were successful in several states making seduction of prostitution a crime. Now, one of the major themes we've talked about earlier was the perfectibility of man, and really, if you think about moral reform, that's what it's doing, is making man better. One of the best examples is found in Dorothea Dix. In 1821, she wrote her first book, Conversations on Common Things, talking about natural science, but mostly moral improvement. She took that and jumped in with prisons and jails. She visited jails and also almshouses, and she found women were housed with prisoners. Mentally ill women were housed with male prisoners, and she made great efforts to rectify this. She ended up finding her first success in Massachusetts, 1843. She made a report to the legislature and got a law passed. And then between 1845 and 1852, 9 other states set up hospitals for the mentally ill. And again, the concept here was the idea of rehabilitation, the perfectibility of man. People can change for the better. I briefly mentioned almshouses. These were houses for the poor. A thing to remember during this time, there is no welfare, there's no government-sanctioned help for the poor. So these almshouses, these charity houses for the poor to go to, was really the only place they had to go. Now, switching into education, another major area of reform. When you think early on in education, we're talking about private academies, hiring a tutor. This is for the wealthy to a large degree. But the shift comes because as we get into the 1820s, especially 1830s, as we've talked before, we have a great expansion in the voting franchise, the number of people who can vote. And the goal here is to have an educated electorate. And then we start getting into, again, the idea of the perfectibility of man. If we educate people, they can make the world better. Now, on the women's end of it, we're going to start in 1821 with Emma Willard. In upstate New York, in Troy, New York, she opens the Troy Female Seminary, a school dedicated to women. And realized to this point, any women who was educated at all, they were trained to become mothers, to raise, enough to reading and writing so they could raise their kids. But here the women learned Latin, learned Greek, and studied things that would go beyond just raising children. Moving forward, in 1831, we have Prudence Crandall down in Canterbury, Connecticut, opened up a school for women. Became quite controversial. Several years after the school was opened, one of her neighbors had a black servant staying with her, and Prudence took the girl in as a student. And this caused great controversy. the families of Canterbury would not have their daughters educated with a black girl, and by 1834 she was forced to close. So this is kind of interesting because not only are we talking about women in education, but we're also, the issue of race comes into play. And again, America in 1833 was not really open to black and white children being educated together. Now, as we move on here, we got to look at Horace Mann a bit, Franklin's own. Pre-Civil War, we only had 2 states that had compulsory attendance. But by 1830s, there was a demand for the concept of what they call a free school. Again, not for the most kids. The free school was meant for the poor kids. The educated would still go to the private academies. The well-to-do would go there. And Horace Mann, helps bring this change. 1837, he was elected as the first secretary of the Boards of Education in Massachusetts. And with this, he had gone overseas to Prussia and seen what they had done. And he brought back the idea of more teacher training, and we're talking largely female teachers. Brought around curriculum reform, better organized curriculum, and he doubled the state funding for education so that more kids could go to school. By 1850, every single state had a form of public education, so it shows you how quickly this idea caught on. Again, the idea of perfectibility, man falls into this. Now, sliding back on the women's end of this, we're going to go 1837. We have Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, opened by Mary Lyon. This will eventually become Mount Holyoke College. It's still open today. Also in 1837, we have Oberlin College, open out in Ohio. Oberlin's interesting. It was a co-educational school. In 1837, they admitted 4 women. The president of the school, interesting enough, was Charles Grandison Finney. Yes, the same one from the Second Great Awakening, excuse me. Now, the following year, Sarah Grimke, we've talked about the Grimkes before, she has her book, Letters on the Equality of Sexes and the Condition of Women, comes out. And a major focus of the book was talking about the limited education offered for women. And she thought this was a way of society holding women back. Now, speaking of literature and the growth over time, there's a couple things to look at here in the role of women in abolition at the same time. One, in 1830s, we should talk about Maria Stuart real quickly. Maria Stuart was an African-American who was recruited by William Lloyd Garrison to go out and be an abolitionist. What she did a thing called visitation. She was invited into homes and kind of gave a personal message of slavery. She is obviously before Frederick Douglass in that movement catches on, but here was a woman putting herself out there. The next one is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe, in 1852, and I know we're getting a little ahead in time here, wrote a book entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin. The story here is of a slave, a good Christian slave. He goes through many hardships in life and ends up being killed by his owner. And what's interesting is the juxtaposition. Stowe has created the slaves in the story are the heroes. The bad guy is the white guy. And this is radical for this time period. And she did a lot for really showing the human aspect of slavery. Kind of removed the image of slavery and introduced them as humans and kind of placed a face and names on slave in a whole new way. This book ended up selling over 3 million copies. It had drama, there was mother and child, there was reality of life. It was a deeply impactful book. Matter of fact, some years later, Stowe has the opportunity to meet President Lincoln, and he says, "So you're the woman who caused the Civil War." Kind of joking about the impact of her book, but it was widely read, and it really changed the view of slavery. Your book also had mentioned another great piece, which is The Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. A great book written by a female author who was a survivor of slavery. The other thing interesting your book didn't mention, I do want to mention, is it wasn't published until 1861. The Civil War is already going on, so it's kind of out of place of where we are. But again, an amazing story. She really talked a lot about sexual abuse, which Frederick Douglass had avoided. And she really let a lot of America know for the first time how frequent it was for slave owners to be having sex with their slaves, and kind of the whole other side of slavery that was unknown until that time. Now, splits in the cause. There's a lot of things that are going on here at the same time. As we get into the 1840s, into the 1850s, you really kind of find 3 different groups. And I'll summarize them as Beecher, Grimke's, and Truth. Beecher, as we saw already, is very much mainstream, very religious, talking about women's role in the home. She believer in the cult of domesticity. And she's at odds with the Grimkes, these women who are speaking out and speaking outside the home and talking about change in society, not just change in raising children, but in society, and she's opposed to that. But at the same time, the Grimkes were challenged by somebody such as Sojourner Truth, who's pictured here. Sojourner was a runaway slave, a wonderful public speaker, and there was real controversy because some were challenged by the fact that she was a black woman. So was she an abolitionist or a women's rights speaker? And she has a famous quote that she says, "Am I not a woman in a cistern?" I have the image there with it. But she kind of challenged the public acceptance of what a female abolitionist could be. I want to jump to another topic your book didn't have, but I think it's interesting during the same time period, again, how women are bringing change. The first one is in 1849, we have Elizabeth Blackwell. Elizabeth Blackwell was a very interesting character. First woman to graduate from medical college, and after graduation, she opened the New York Infirmary for women and children. She believed that there was a need in medicine to focus on women and children. Largely, we're talking about the birthing process. This is pre-gynecology. This is a new focus of medicine that people thought were radical at the time. And of course, most major cities now have a hospital dedicated toward women and children, much like Brigham's here in Boston. The other I'd like to talk to is about, again, back to Catherine Beecher. Catherine Beecher in the early 50s took a national survey of women's health and came up with some amazing numbers. She found out that over 3/4 of women were considered sick. Why? Well, several things factored into it. One, a large percentage of women actually did not bathe regularly. The limited access to water was used for the men to bathe and for the children to be bathed. Quite often they would bathe last in the same water. Other thing was a lack of exercise. Women were busy, with household chores. There was not a free time. There was not, organized sports for women, things like that. And then finally, she pointed out the danger of corsets. Demoed here is you see a picture of an 1850s corset, and it was meant to give a woman an hourglass shape, but it was basically constricting her organs to the point where it was unhealthy. Women couldn't breathe normally while looking the way that fashion wanted to look. And obviously, this is continuing on today, that fashion has not always been comfortable for women, that they're more meant to look a certain way. These dictates go all the way back, as you can see, to the 1850s. Now, getting back to the political realm of things, I want to talk a little bit about Seneca Falls. 1848, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, the two women pictured here, organized a women's rights meeting in upstate New York, in Seneca Falls, New York. And in the meeting, a lot of things were discussed, but the big thing came out of it was the Declaration of Sentiments. This was a document that mirrored in many ways the Declaration of Independence, almost word for word, with slight changes, talking about women declaring their right, as opposed to the United States declaring that all men are created equal. This was all women were created equal, and so forth. Now, don't let numbers fool you here. The book mentioned that it was attended by some 70 women and 30 men, and it makes it sound like it's not much. It's not the number of people as much as the fact that they did meet and speak about such things as women eventually having the right to vote, and that women were demanding, if you will, or expressing the fact that they were equal to men. That was the radical aspect of it that really got a lot of things going. Matter of fact, by 1850, in Worcester, Massachusetts, there was the first ever National Women's Rights Convention, where they set an agenda talking about equality in church, that religion should treat women as equal, talked about custody rights for women, called for women's right to testify, and even for the women's right to vote. So again, this really got a lot of political activity going, including Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony would become one of the great women's rights leaders of the 1800s. One of her key things was she was very well organized and set women up in groups organized by what was called captains. And they would go to each state and they would fight for political change. I mean, a very simple early win for her was in 1860 in the state of New York. She got the right for women to own their own wages. Prior to this, either their parents or husbands had the right to claim the women's wages. So a small change, but a beginning of much larger. Again, Susan B. Anthony will go on to great fame during the 1800s. So looking back, I need you to see that during this time period, there's a lot of change that happens in many different fields with a lot of different women. But they are the women that came out of the Second Great Awakening. They do believe in the perfectibility of man. They do see the need for change in society. They may not believe in the same direction or focus in the same area, but all of it comes down to making life better and looking for equality. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.